Hello guys, this is question number 1 of practice exam 2, and in this question we are going to evaluate the values of a function square root of 32 minus 8x squared minus 8y squared, and we're going to need to graph the domain of the function. So this particular question has a multiple choice, but on the test you will actually have to graph it by hand. Now, we need to know about the square root and also compare that with the natural log function. So there is a big difference there. If you have square root, then the expression under the square root must be greater than or equal to 0. So here we are including the boundary of the actual region, whatever we get. The boundary is included because square root of 0 is 0, that is defined. So you're going to draw the boundary solid. But if you have natural log, if you had exact same question, but instead of square root, you had natural log, then the boundary must be dashed because natural log of 0 is actually undefined. So that's the main difference. So for example, I already know here, so that any graph that has a dashed line, that would be incorrect. So it's got to be solid. Okay, so the first thing let's do is compute some values. So here f of 0, -2. So we're just plugging in x equals 0 and y equals -2. Now, whenever we plug in a negative number, either get rid of the negative or put it in parentheses, but you cannot leave it without parentheses. That would be incorrect. So it looks like I've got 32, and then subtract 8 times 4 is also 32. So that is square root of 0, which is 0. So that we know right here that that's 0. Okay. The next is f of 2, 0. So we are plugging 2 for x, and we are plugging 0 for y. So here we get, looks like 32 minus 32, and again, looks like that's 0. Okay, so that looks like, oops. 1 second. Okay, now what is f of 2, 2? So here we take square root and we plug in 2 for x and also 2 for y. Okay, so we see that 8 times 4 is actually 32, so 32 minus 32 will give us 0, but we are not going to be able to get rid of this last term, which will be negative under the root. So generally speaking, negatives are handled if you had complex numbers. You would say that that's square root of 32i, but because this is just real number system, we're just going to say that does not exist. So at 2, 2, 2, 2 is not in the domain, so we already know that. Okay, and then the last one is f of 0, 0, which is very easy. That's just square root of 32. So that, please make sure that you do not ever enter any decimals here. We want to enter the answers exact. Now you can actually simplify the square root, but that is not necessary. But decimals you should not do. Okay, so next, let's see if we want to figure out the domain of this function. So in order to do that, again, go back to the fact that 32 minus 8x squared minus 8y squared should be greater than or equal to 0. To solve this inequality, the first thing we do is actually make it equal 0, and that's going to be the boundary of the domain. So we make it equal 0 and see if we can rewrite it in a format that we can recognize. So if we were to move 32 by subtracting it from both sides, we'll get negative 8x squared negative 8y squared equals negative 32. And then we divide everything by negative 8. And that'll allow us to write it as x squared plus y squared equals 32 over 8 is 4. And hopefully you recognize that this is a circle of radius 2. So I already know that the boundary of the domain is going to be the circle, and it is going to be solid. Again, because the inequality was more than or equal to, right? So the circle itself will be included in the domain. Okay, so here we got the circle that looks like this. And again, this is going to be solid. Okay, the next thing we got to do is figure out, okay, well, is this going to be inside the circle or outside the circle? So here we have to pick a test point Now, very important, and a lot of students are not understanding this. Whatever point you pick, it cannot belong to the boundary. In other words, if you substitute x and y into here, you're not gonna get equal 0. Okay, so for example, over here, for example, 0, -2. Well, 0, -2 cannot be chosen as a point, a test point, because 0, -2 actually belongs to the boundary. Okay, so you can pick any other point. So I am going to pick 0, 0. Then you're going to go to your inequality, which is right here, and you're going to insert x equals 0 and y equals 0 in for x and y. So then we will get 32 and then minus 0, and then that should be greater than or equal to 0. So if this is true, that means that 0, 0 will belong to the domain. And that's really all we need. As long as we get one point that belongs to the domain, we will know if it's inside or outside. Now, so because 0, 0 belongs to the domain, we are going to actually shade everything inside the circle. So that would be a correct answer. Okay, now we also can see over here, for example, in our computations, that at 2, 2, we had does not exist. So that further confirms the fact that 2, 2, which would be somewhere over here, would not belong to the domain. So I need to find the choice that is inside the circle with the solid line.